transforming security along with the business.
As we've come out of this really unusual phase in our lives with the pandemic, there is this thing about transforming security along with the business. It's real because we were forced to do a lot of things over the last couple of years that we maybe weren't ready for. If you had a digital transformation plan for 3 to 5 years, guess what? It's now 3 to 5 days, maybe weeks, if you were lucky enough. Yeah. And so I thought that made sense to be the premier topic for, I think, today and for this group. I'm going to start just by saying hello. My name's John Yo. I'm the head of research over here at CSA. We do a lot of cool things, not just events, but we do a lot of research that impacts how organizations adopt cloud and transform digitally. I want to just start maybe to my right, and we'll have everybody introduce themselves so we know who we're talking to.
Matt Hathaway. I'm Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer at TrueFort. What we do at TrueFort is very focused on protecting application environments. Microsegmentation is the primary use case, but it's looking at a lot of the migration to the cloud, understanding your legacy environment as well as where you're going. And so you can plan not just a lift and shift, but sometimes a complete transformation into the cloud and really know what's normal, what's running day to day, to work with the application owners and try and develop a security strategy of what's approved behavior.
My name's Kane. I'm the field CISO for Hyperproof. I'm also a senior member of the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. I have been in cybersecurity for over 20 years now, and most of my focus these days is on legal and regulatory compliance, which is kind of a weird career arc to take. And that maps nicely to what we do at Hyperproof, which is helping companies achieve efficiencies around their compliance operations, because I think we can all agree we're getting into a world that is more litigious and where audits and assessments are going to become not an annual Super Bowl event, but it's going to become a normal workflow for many organizations, especially in less regulated industries right now.
Hey, I'm David Richardson. I'm VP of Product for Lookout. Lookout you might know as a company that secures mobile devices, Android and iOS devices. That's how we got our start, back 12, 13 years ago, which is when I joined the company. These days, we are really focused on securing the digital transformation that every organization is going through as far as adopting new cloud technology and whatnot. And we're really focused on an endpoint to cloud security story where you understand, from a zero trust perspective, everything about your device's health, but also all of the data that it's accessing, all the cloud services that it's accessing, and each and every bit and byte that's flowing to and from those devices. My background is in engineering and security. Been a hands-on developer. I've spoken at Black Hat and DEF CON in the past on various Android and iOS vulnerabilities that I've discovered in the past.
I'm Jasmine Henry. I'm a security director at Jupiter One, so I'm a security practitioner and a security vendor. Jupiter One does cyber asset and attack surface management. I have spent a lot of my career doing security, privacy, compliance, and security research at cloud-native startups. And I'm also a candidate for a PhD in computer and information sciences at UALR. And I am planning to do my research on quantitative prediction of the breakdown rate of interplanetary space exploration craft, which is actually incredibly applicable to security because we're predicting failure rates all the time.
Yeah, super cool. Thank you all for being here. It's a very experienced and educated group of experts up here. I'm excited to have these conversations. And, maybe we just dig into things too. I know we talked about digital transformation. We talked about how the businesses had to move very forward in order to stay afloat. We've had to increase our footprint digitally. We had to adopt tools that maybe we weren't ready for. But just, Jasmine, staying with you, how has security been able to keep up with the business? Maybe a better question is, has security been able to keep up with the business over the last 2 years?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. I think that the demands on security have dramatically increased over the last few years. Prior to the onset of COVID-19, if a company wanted to deploy a payment app, a telehealth instance, it may have been a 6 to 18 month development cycle. And what happened in March 2020 was companies were deploying this overnight. And the speed of development hasn't really slowed down since. I don't think executives would like it to. So we have had to completely change the way that our systems are architected. We've had to change the way that developers engineer products by creating developer platforms, by abstracting decisions away from them. And security is managing a whole bunch of tiny little components that are built for flexibility and speed. And I think the result is an environment where security is really, really hard.
But it's almost been expedited. So we're going from 16 to 18 month cycles to, hey, we got to do this quicker, and it's not going to change anytime soon. Is that right? Wow. Dave, do you want to comment on that too, actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really touched on a key point at the very beginning where you talked about how everyone's cybersecurity and digital transformation roadmap had to be accelerated. It wasn't that you were suddenly doing things that you weren't planning to do. Like it wasn't like you weren't going to move to the cloud, or you weren't going to enable more work from home, or you weren't going to try to decrease your reliance on on-prem infrastructure and a VPN and those kinds of things. It's just that you had to do it so much faster than you had plans for. So you might have built out these plans for, hey, we're going to move all of this data from on-prem to the cloud over the next 3-5 years. And now suddenly, you need to figure out, how do people get access to that data while they're working from home, in a couple of weeks. And so, I mean, of course, going to the core of your question, which is, has cybersecurity kept up with the business? I mean, I'll say yes, but primarily by taking on more risk, by prioritizing, what are the things that, we can delay for today and come back to 6, 12 months from now and address, and what are the things that are actually mission critical that we need to address immediately. And I think security and the business being at odds, I think that's also that's something that I think that we should address, because ideally they should be working hand in hand, right? They should be when you have security being perceived as working against the business or enabling, compliance within the business, then it's perceived as a blocker, and it's perceived as something that gets in the way. And, inside this room, I think we all get it, but outside this room, security is sometimes seen as the enemy and not someone who is on the business's side, right? That you actually, the reason why you have these security policies, controls, tools, training, et cetera, is to keep each individual and the organization safe. But I think a lot of people that don't work in security, they view it as like, these are the police, right? The police that are going to slap me on the wrist and say, you shouldn't have clicked on that link. And, you get into situations where sometimes those are the consequences that people are fearing.
Can I just touch on something you said about risk there? So I think the companies where security is partnering with the business have a much more mature view and are willing to give an open space to have conversations about risk. Mm-hmm. Because the companies where you're describing, the user doesn't want to tell security because they're the Department of No, or they're the police and they're going to come get you. I think that at the board level, that is really where that culture has to be driven. And what we're seeing is companies that have got siloed risk management, where you've got your magical cybersecurity risk management, which is somehow totally different than business risk management. They're having a bit of a bad time of it, because the CISO wonders, why did my budget get cut? They don't have context of, well, digital transformation is consuming these resources, or we're doing a multinational expansion, or what have you. And so where you really look at the efficacy is, first of all, for companies that don't have a risk management program at all, you're going to have a very bad day. Every day is probably going to be a bad day. Please go fix that. And if you do, start looking at how do you have a closer integration and a more mature conversation around risk, because cyber risk ultimately is business risk.
I love that. I want to take something from a panel yesterday. Sean Harris, who's an industry CISO, he said something really smart, I thought, because it goes two ways, right? He said, it's not about what I need for my security program. It's what we need for business resiliency. And when you're having those board conversations, I think that hits home a lot more. So I think that's a great point, Kane. Dave was talking about acceleration of tools and transformation that we've had to do. You also mentioned remote work. So, Matt, what do you think about that too? So we've also had to not just accelerate, but scale, because remote work was supposed to be like 20%, and then ended up being a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean, what we saw was, and this is somewhat part of what Dave mentioned before, is the accepted risk became, even in organizations where everybody was security and the business were aligned, there was suddenly like, well, we don't have time for that alignment now. We can't stick to the plan. We'll just figure it out later. And what they didn't realize was some things that weren't even security tools broke down and couldn't handle it, right? Like you couldn't scale, you couldn't suddenly support and manage endpoints across millions not on your network. And there were all these things they could not handle, the business couldn't handle, security couldn't. But what people often also don't talk about is the security professionals themselves. There was this culture of, you come into a secured SOC and you have your day job, and then you have all the tools you need. And suddenly we had to shift to having them all be able to do this at home. And so they had the same challenges that IT did. And every worker was, how do I get the context and the visibility I need from my home laptop? I haven't built out an entire, stack and set of all the tools I need. And do we have remote access? And do we have reverse proxy so I can get back into the business? There were all these new challenges introduced because they couldn't plan that 12 months in advance. This is when we'll do security assessment. This is when we'll move on to this other stage. It was suddenly like, no, we're doing this and we'll fix it in a year when we can have security come in. And it caused chaos. Yeah. People having, completely unpatched laptops at home, much more vulnerable than they normally would have been. It was just so many struggles introduced.
Wow. So let's fix it later.
Yeah. Because you can't shut down the whole company for a week, right?
Yeah. Kane, we talked about, I guess, you mentioned risk, right? And tipping the scales from adoption and taking on more risk in order to do that. Have we seen it change? Are we going back now? Now we need to kind of balance out that risk, fix some of the stuff that we were working on a couple years ago, or kind of like what I've heard earlier today too, is actually we're still moving forward. We're just continuing to adopt these accelerated principles.
Yeah, I think that the challenge we ultimately run with risk is companies which have not invested in figuring out where their data are probably at the highest risk. And where I'm seeing the highest success is companies where there's a partnership with the CFO. Because you consider a company that had like Sarbanes-Oxley, as a for instance, if you could not describe where your financial data are stored, you're going to have a very hard conversation with your auditor. Right? Well, there are multiple audit standards. There are multiple supply chain standards. There are multiple requirements. You actually know where the bodies are buried. And companies that are charging forward with digital transformation with few guardrails over where it's acceptable to store stuff, the whole concern about, well, you might lose an employee's laptop that's unencrypted. We don't have litigation because of loss of a laptop. We have data breach litigation that happens today, and I think that a lot of the companies that don't have good visibility and good ability to attest to their internal controls working adequately on their data because they don't know where the stuff is stored, I think they're probably at the highest levels of risk. The challenge in that, from a CISO's perspective, is finding the right balance, where your AWS and your GCP and your Azure developers want to find the latest, coolest, neatest whiz-bang to store stuff that has, inevitably, if it's one of those vendors, has a cute name. It's hard to keep track of all that stuff. So you have to have best practices built in and some governance built in. So there's a way for a developer to say, hey, I'd like to use this thing. Cool, you can go use it in the sandbox, right? This is not a new development pattern. We've had this in software development for years. We have to continue that part that worked while still enabling the business to make changes with a view towards, that's a data storage that's stored in Russia. Right? Russian Federation probably don't want to be storing your data there, especially if you're doing ITAR, right? So having those guardrails written down for folks, I think, does help.
Can I actually ask a follow-up question on that? So, when you're thinking about compliance versus reducing risk versus protecting the business, sometimes these are almost positioned as different opposing ideas, as opposed to all in service of the same goal. And, when I have a customer, I'm a vendor, right? Like when I have a customer say, oh, I just need this compliance checkbox, it really means like, I don't care how good your solution is. It just needs to, exist. Meet the requirements. It needs to exist. It needs to be deployed. And that's what matters to me. So, it's almost antithetical to the idea of keeping the business safe and secure. And I'm just curious, because you opened with kind of a conversation about how we're going to move from a world of audits being a major event to being just the way that business moves forward. How do you think about balancing those ideas and making sure that you can be compliant and insecure, but if all you've done is check a bunch of boxes with a bunch of tools that don't actually communicate with one another?
So I think that's how you get ants. And that's what I think we've been doing for years. You can look at something like PCI DSS, which solves problems we had 10 years ago. You can look right now at what the FBI is publishing. And if you're not subscribed to the FBI's publications, they are a great open source intelligence feed that if you get on TLP White stuff, it's great. Because you can predict now that's what they're observing in the field, and the companies that don't actually put in or have compensating controls, that's going to drive the next wave of regulation, right? Well, the reason we got Sarbanes-Oxley is because we had Enron. All of these we can trace back to deleterious events that businesses said, this is an acceptable risk. We're going to take this risk that nothing bad will happen. The challenge we have in today's world is we're all kind of living in a Black Mirror version of IT, where overseas threat actors are effectively running startups where they're building malicious code to exfiltrate either data or money or both at the same time, primarily from Western nations. So corporate companies that look at this and say, well, this is not a solvable problem. I just need to, comply with FFIEC or New York Section 500, flavor of the month, right? I think that's too limited of a scope. I do think we have generally solved the cybersecurity control question of what works. And in Connecticut and Ohio and Utah, they've said, look, if you've got you're following NIST, you're following CIS-CSC, we literally don't care. Please follow some published methodology that's not Joe's House of Security, right? If you do that, you get an affirmative tort defense. We're starting to see the legal system say, if you're following a framework, you're probably doing better than the rest of the industry. I think if we can all move to that level where CISO can say, look, we're going to apply this framework. It's going to cover most of our regulatory needs, and we can cover some little one-off stuff to manage our risk. We're in a much better place than if we continue accepting the risk and knowing 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to get litigated or regulated into doing the thing we didn't want to do.
I want to hear what Jasmine has to say too, but to summarize, we're talking about just inherited controls across your supply chain. That's the big challenge, or at least the goal. Jasmine, what do you think about that too?
I think that Kane is really well spoken. That was a really interesting, thoughtful answer. I think that I also have a few opinions on this that are probably kind of unpopular. I think that if security is approving every change before it goes into production, they are no longer enabling the business. They have become a liability. And I think that security and compliance has become more about understanding complexity in production and being able to fine-tune those guardrails, understanding dependencies. I've worked with graphs a lot in my life, and the level of dependencies along our CI/CD pipelines is like nothing we've dealt with before. So I think security's job is to enable the business, which includes keeping developers happy by constantly fine-tuning those guardrails. And it's going to require new mindsets on compliance. But I think it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. No, I think because it kind of touches on what we talked about earlier, how everything's been accelerated. And the business, they don't necessarily care about how the sausage is made, right? They just want new apps, new engagement, new products. And so I think that's a big challenge, right?
I would completely agree. And what I've seen most successful with the organizations that we've worked with is when they both attach to business objectives.
Yep.
Like, hey, we have this new project. We're not, transformation is how many, 10, 20 years? This one is this critical application we're moving to the cloud. But we don't have the visibility. We don't know why disruptions happen. So if you can target showing them why downtime occurs and not just think, hey, let's prevent threats, but like anything that takes down production environment or any portion of it is bad for the business. And security is really one of the best positioned to help the developers, help operations identify those and misconfigurations that are causing, bandwidth drain and all of these different things that aren't pure security controls. But if you can have that back and forth and they see that you're trying to help them have maximum uptime and fewer outages, then that becomes a better conversation and they're much more willing to say, okay, you can install something, you can have something, a view into production as opposed to just don't touch it.
Yeah, I like that. Matt, from that perspective too, I think those are, great points. How do we, how do we educate the entire business on what security is? We talked about production with developers. We mentioned earlier about the board and making decisions based on security for the business. How do we go about doing that? What do you think?
I mean, it's obviously it's never worked to just be fear-based. It never worked. And it's got to be more of and it's not, hey, a breach could cost us this many. Nobody cares, right? It has to be in their language. It has to be translated to how many pennies do you lose if there's a server down? How many, per second, how many millions of dollars if you can't get access to production and roll back a new upgrade? Any of those sort of things they think about and how they think about it. And then like for transformation, it's not, but we also need to pass the security gate. It's, hey, do we have the tools to make sure this is secure from day one? And we can, this project can skip that 3-month like planning, building in new controls. Instead, it's like, these are already planned for, and it's got to be all in their language. It's how many days of employee time and productivity are going to be saved, and how many fewer servers can they have if you implement this a certain way instead of later on bolting on a sidecar, a 20% raise in all containers. Like those sort of conversations are what they want to hear. They don't want to hear, we're installing another agent. It's going to slow down and take CPU. Right? That's not.
They want to know, how much is it going to cost me? How much is it going to save me?
Yeah.
Sure. Dave, you talked about, even from a customer perspective, hey, security doesn't equal compliance, or compliance doesn't equal security necessarily. How do you educate your customers that, hey, this is, a baseline, maybe these are inherited controls, but even Kane mentioned compensating controls needed. How do we get that message across to our customers?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a defense in depth strategy for any of these things, right? That's a crucial part. But I think if you think about the way that a lot of businesses have transformed security along with the business, it's been replacing one technology with another technology each step of the way. So, okay, I used to store my data in network drive, SMB share or something like that, and now I store it in OneDrive or Google Drive or something like that, right? So what did you do when you made that transformation? Did you just find all of the security solutions that you used to kind of wrap around the SMB share and try to apply those in the cloud? Did you forget about most of those steps along the way? But like from from pure compliance perspective, it's like you can still say, hey, I've got DLP. It's hard drive centric DLP, but I've got it. So maybe that applies. Maybe, but perhaps it's completely irrelevant because of the changes that have happened with the business, right? That you now have you're in a different world where someone's not sticking a USB thumbstick into the laptop to copy data from one file system to another. You've got someone clicking share in Google Drive and typing in an email address and it accidentally auto-completing someone's personal Gmail and clicking share.
Wow.
Those bits didn't move from one hard drive to another in that process. And, the tools that you've used may not have actually transformed with the way that people started to do business in a different way. On the other extreme, you don't want to recreate all of the complexity that you had inside of your organization to protect the traditional perimeter-based castle and moat model. You don't want to go and say, okay, where's my firewall? Where's my NAC? Where are all of these individual tools one by one that I need to go and deploy, and then somehow get all of the data from all of the people that are working from home to flow through that same system? Because what that looks like is over-provision my VPN and have everyone connect via the VPN all the time. Mm-hmm. And, if you look at any of the recent breaches, it's VPN access that's the problem, right? It's that people are getting access to VPN and then they're able to move laterally within those systems, right? So it's, you have to actually transform your security strategy as your business is transforming. You can't just rely on the old strategy that you had, but nor can you go try to recreate all of the complexity that you had. I hope
everybody's listening too, because I think that's an important thing. As technology changes, so does our strategy, business strategy and security strategy. Kane, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I just want to, so you're covering there almost a gap analysis, mm-hmm. right? And that's what a lot of companies will actually do, is they'll have an independent consultancy do a gap analysis, yep. Say, what controls do we have? What controls are we missing? And where I think a lot of companies break down at that point is they go, okay, control number 311 becomes before 312, so I guess we do that one first. And that's the wrong approach, and I know that sounds judgy. Where I find it's more effective is if you do a gap analysis for your control set, have an independent organization do a MITRE attack analysis to really look at what are your threat actors honest to goodness doing, right? Because if you've got threat actors that are engaging with you that don't do data exfil via HTTP, but maybe instead they do a lot of phishing and a lot of credential stuffing or credential theft because you're dealing with an initial access broker provision, build up those controls first, right? It comes down to a monetary conversation of you have a finite amount of resources and a number of money you can spend on this. And just because control 1 becomes before control number 2 in your gap analysis doesn't make any business sense, right? Like get that independent perspective, or maybe your own team. If you're blessed to have a red team, ask them this question. If you're the CISO or if you're the CEO or CFO, go ask your red team, hey, what are we seeing our techniques and tactics? Then you map your controls and say, okay, if we spend money here, we're actually getting a material reduction in risk. If we spend our money on something else, even though it might be the latest shift left, zero trust XDR cool thing, it's not going to buy us anything, right? Make those informed buying decisions.
I like that. We have to really understand our environment, and what better than an attack analysis or some sort of threat modeling like that too. Mm-hmm. I know we have questions from the audience that came in too, so I want to hand it over to Jeff, who's managing all the questions coming from our lovely group today.
Right. So do you have a question, or are you waving hello? Oh, okay then. All right, well, you're closest, so you win.
I don't know what's on the lunch menu, Daniela.
All right. Well, it's going to be an easy question, hopefully. So we have been hearing a lot during yesterday and then today on the importance of the return on investment. That is supposed to be the way in which we go and communicate primarily with our board of directors. Now, my question is, are we really sure that our industry is mature enough to be able to provide reliable return on investment measurement? Because as far as I can tell, we can provide a good approximation of the cost of doing nothing, but when it comes to have a precise measurement of the ROI, I don't think we are there. So are we building on false promises that we cannot comply with, at least for the next few years?
Can I take
we have an applaud there.
Can I take a stab at this one first?
Yeah.
So I think
thanks for the applause, Walt.
You really have a good point there around return on investment because, if you're the CISO presenting the board, you want to show like you spent $1 on security and you got $1.20 back. That's neat. So if you're currently doing qualitative risk management, you probably have a stoplight chart that your board would like you to stop please showing. I find the best thing in that if you're doing qualitative is a histogram showing here's how much money we spent, here's how our risk profile has changed, and hopefully the risk curve is going down and the spending is staying flat. If the risk curve is going up and the spending is going up, I hope your LinkedIn is up to date. If, however, you have wanted to get to a true ROI for cybersecurity investment, you have to move to a quantitative measurement method, and I think we could all agree here FAIR is pretty reasonable in that. The challenge in dropping in FAIR is that's not like a 6-month project. Right? So if you want to get there, first of all, get everybody to buy in and say, yeah, we want to calculate how much all this stuff costs, but know that the plumbing exercise is going to be costly into itself.
So Kane, just to summarize what Kane said too, we're talking about risk measurement quantitatively. It's hard, and you guys use the FAIR Institute for some of the.
If we have to do quantitative, I mean, there are of course other models.
Great, Jasmine, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so my boss is actually moderating the FAIR conference today. So I think he would probably point to that, and I feel like I've got an answer that's a little bit weirder, of course. I try to be in fewer security conversations and more revenue conversations. I don't think that I am necessarily the expert voice in every security conversation. I think that developer perspectives matter a lot, and being able to facilitate their conversations about threat modeling, whether or not it's following a certain framework, they're talking about threats. That's important. And I kind of insert myself in about half of our sales conversations proactively and early in the process, and then I can point to, I helped close X percentage of revenue. And it also creates that openness, that dialogue with our customers.
Yeah. I'll just add that what I've seen from the least frustrated security customers is they do in small chunks. They find a small win, an easy calculation. Like, hey, our team has been dealing with the IT team and security have combined been dealing with 2 account compromises a week. We just have to implement MFA. We think we can get this down to 2 a quarter. And just that's quick math of productivity both on the end user, the IT team, and the security team. That right there it's very simplistic, but remember, most of the board has no idea what security is. So finding some of those quick wins and be like, see, we got a lot of cost savings out of this. We got better productivity and bonus, we're more secure. Then you find another one. And even if it's a big project, say, okay, we'll start with this one critical application or this one office and just prove out some sort of cost savings, some sort of improvement in performance, and then say, yeah, now we want to scale this out. But if you try and bite it all off at once, no matter what the tech, what the process, that's where it's like, okay, well, we are a year and a half in. Have we really seen the ROI as versus, we got a quick win. We have some trust. We can move on to the next project and try and do the same.
Right. Right. There are the things that you can measure, like total cost of ownership and the amount of staff that's needed to stay on top of the threat landscape, like those kinds of things. Those are things you can measure, but at the end of the day, you're not making money, right? You couldn't shut down all the other parts of the business and just spend on cybersecurity and have a return on investment, right? Like that.
Yeah, don't
go out of business.
Don't make those false promises.
Yes.
Right.
We should educate our industry using the right metrics in order to represent what we do before.
Yeah.
Running after financial measurements.
For those who can't hear, we're talking about we need to find a way to measure risk versus just financial gain out of this, right? And I think it's harder than if we knew how to do that, we'd probably be doing that pretty good, right? I see a lot of security scoring methods, and how reliable are they? I think the best thing is that they're using them as indicators, right? As long as I'm going up, well, if a high score means I'm good anyways. As long as we're moving forward, I think that's good.
Right, but a lot of it can help you prioritize where to act. So it's good for that. It's not good to translate that and say, here's our risk, because the board's not going to understand it.
We have a question.
Jeff, hey.
Hi, yes, I have a question, or probably a query, and that deals with training. You have a company, and you have provided quite a bit of extensive training for the employees because you know that that's where the problem lies ultimately. But you have one or two employees that sort of find all sort of excuses as to not to do the training. So at the end of the day, you have one or two of them that have probably went on leave or some other flimsy excuse. How do you handle that? Because the training is mandatory. Thank you.
I hope I'm summarizing this okay. So how do we handle employees that don't know how to make good security decisions? Does that sound about right?
Sorry, sir. What was that?
Yeah. Did I summarize that correctly? Yeah. The question is, how do we handle employees that don't make good security decisions? How do we build resiliencies around that?
I mean, they are aware, but they find excuses. They come up with sort of excuses not to do the training. They either go on vacation. Okay, let me just expound further.
Sure.
They get the notices. Let's say prior to the vacation, they're aware of it. Okay, they come back, they still don't attempt it, or they probably go on sick leave and come back before the deadline is over, and they get a notice again, and they don't. And then the day have arrived, the actual deadline, and they still don't do it.
Okay.
And it is mandatory. What do you do in that case? Because you don't really want to fire them. I mean, that is extreme. What do you do in that case?
Have you ever heard of suicidal kangaroo theory? It's a real thing. So there is a certain percentage of the kangaroo population in Australia, and it's somewhere around 10%, that was not able to evolve to recognize that running in front of cars is dangerous. 90% of the kangaroos figured it out, somehow passed it off to their offspring. But there's certain kangaroo lines that do not recognize the danger of moving vehicles, even though they've been around for, 110 years now. I kind of think of awareness and humans, and I don't want to say the same way, but assume a certain failure rate. Assume a certain failure rate to be empathetic towards people.
Yeah, I guess, so we see training's not always good enough. I mean, I think I've seen a lot of people do phishing campaigns, but I think people continue to fall for them. So
I think the percentage of users that are non-responsive to training and simulation is actually higher than 10%, and there's evidence to back that up.
I think a model that works well is a conditional access model that's based on completion of your training, right? So you can only, depending on what level of access you need, if you need to be able to SSH into production boxes, like you literally can't do that unless you've completed the training. Like you just make sure that employee, and at a certain point, they're not going to get fired because they didn't do their training. They're going to get fired because they can't do their job, right? If you set up intelligent rules and boundaries to say, you have to complete this training in order to be able to, if you get to this certification level, then you're able to, access this level of system or access customer records, like those kinds of things.
Great. Okay.
Right. It's train, but then monitor the sort of activity that's not intrusive but important, right?
Yeah.
Like make sure people accessing production are doing it the way you've defined they have to. And if they don't, it gets cut off and they have to go through a follow-up training.
Cool. Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question, so we're going to take the last question over there in the corner. I think I see Walt. Hey.
Hey. A bit of a challenge for all of us when it comes to risk modeling and thinking about reduction of risk in financial terms. As the business grows and it is increasingly successful, the actual impact is going to grow. You kind of want that. You want the business to grow. You want your risk models to show an increase in risk of something going wrong. You don't really want to reduce that because that could mean reducing business growth. Think about it critically. Now think about reducing the probability of an event as perhaps the better thing to try to work on rather than reduction of risk financially. it might get you a better outcome with the business. Just thinking out of the box.
Interesting comment from Walt. So as the business grows, risk grows. Hey, that's good.
Yep.
So what should we be focusing on other than that?
So I think that the companies that are effectively handling this today ultimately have a risk committee that is meeting on a regular basis. Like when I used to do assessments for a living, and I'd look at on a risk policy, and I remember one company doing transportation, they did their risk assessment every 4 years. Kind of cringeworthy at that point, because you go, okay, well, the world changes quite a lot faster than 4 years. You all know that, right? I think the companies that are able to look at where their business is today and then on a cadence that makes sense for their industry can then rejigger those numbers and reprioritize based on all of the input that they're receiving. I think that they're in a much better place than a company that does it as a point-in-time exercise. And where we're moving, again, is this continuous compliance, continuous risk monitoring. And don't think I'm saying threats. Don't think I'm saying CVSS scores. I mean risks. Like you're expanding into a new market. You're expanding your services that you're providing. You're diversifying. You're moving on to a new tech stack. All those are effectively risks. If we don't talk about them, if we don't track them, then somebody in the room is blind. And it's probably the CFO or the CISO or the CIO, depending on your organizational structure. And that's where you actually end up with a more significant problem to the business. Because if you couldn't see your risks, or perhaps you had them written down in a risk register and it comes up in adversarial discovery, left hand didn't tell the right hand what was going on, again, you're going to have a very bad time.
You know, maybe that's why risk is so hard to measure, because it changes all the time, right? We don't have the same static measurements every single year. As our business grows, the risk changes. So super interesting. We have final comments here, and sorry, it's got to be quick. So Jasmine, can I start on your end? Just, hey, final comments before we break off for lunch.
You know, I think challenge everything. You know, with regards to the suicidal kangaroo theory, does anybody really need admin access when they're sleeping? You know, I think that we have a remarkable opportunity to rethink our assumptions and learn from others, and I'm really excited about it.
Challenge everything, because we did these last 2 years and we came out pretty good. So I like it. Dave?
I think there was a mention of like gap analysis. I think understand where your data is, understand where your most important data is, where does it lie these days, and how do your security controls allow you to control access to that data today. But I think just starting with that inventory, that audit of where does it live, where does your most crucial data live these days.
That's great. Thanks. Kane?
You know, I want to go back to the fireside chat around hiring here and the conversation associated with how difficult workforce development is. I would encourage anyone who is in this room right now who is a security professional or considers themselves to be, please go speak at a middle school. Go talk to your school board, go talk to your PTA, whoever it is, because if we are not visible members of the community, if we are not out there, kids won't think that they want to do this for a living because they don't know it exists. And right now, we've had a cybersecurity workforce problem since, 2007. So when I think we had the first report on that, so we're now 15 years into a problem. The only way we are going to solve these risks, these challenges, is together by being visible in our communities.
I love that. Let's ingrain security early. Matt, bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like it's related, but it is what I always like to encourage is look at whatever new process, whatever control you want, and think about the impact to the end user who has to, accomplish their task, their job. Like, what's that user experience? How do you make that so they don't feel like this is a burden? Because they bought in, but they also have their daily goals, their monthly goals. If this new security control makes their life harder, it's going to be very frustrating. So,
hey, we fix security by making it customer driven, end user driven. I love it.